up. All right. So the topic is, can we escape polarization's self-reinforcing cycle? And the background to this is not only what's happening in our political world at the moment, but really what's happened for the last 20 years. And the issue of whether or not polarization generates paralysis, and then whether or not paralysis amplifies polarization. And so that's the self-reinforcing cycle, to bring it to its simplest description. Because we can't get things done, we end up in a realm of policy drift, where policy is no longer responsive to people's needs. People end up angry, resentful, and as a result, they end up more hostile in terms of their partisanship, and that generates further paralysis, and we're stuck in a loop. What does 2020 tell us about this? Are there ways out? Those are the big questions. I'm going to review the big picture a little bit and start out with the idea, right, that the most important way to look at the 2020 election is having simultaneous record turnout for both Republicans and Democrats, right? And this was not what many pollsters anticipated, but this is what actually happened. We have a fairly comfortable electoral college victory for Joe Biden. We have a quite resounding popular vote victory, but we have to bear in mind that Donald Trump got more votes than any other presidential candidate in history, with the exception of Joe Biden in this election. And that just as many places in the US moved somewhat to the left relative to 2016, increased their vote for Democratic candidates, many other places in the country moved to the right. And so simultaneous red and blue waves. I've shown you this before, and this is just to point out that this was not a decisive election in either direction. And that although Biden won more votes than any other candidate, Trump also won more votes than any other candidate before. These figures have come up a little bit since the BBC compiled this data. And that had 85,000 votes gone differently in a few states, right, which is 0.05% of the people who voted in this election, Donald Trump would have won this election. Right, and so another way of looking at this is to say that almost all of Joe Biden's margin is accounted for by the state of California, at least in the popular vote. Now, I've also spoken with you about this before, but I want to push down here for a moment because I think it's extremely important. And so when we speak of trifecta states and the big sort, right, we're talking about states where the one party controls all the institutions of state government, controls the governorship and usually a bicameral state legislature. So that's the trifecta, right? And as you can see, in the 1990s and 2000s, it was actually quite common to have split government by party at the state level. It's not until 2010 that we get a big fall off. And this data only goes up to 2016. I'll show you in a moment what happened in 2020 in bipartisan control of state government and a big rise in Republican control. And this is a very deliberate effort designed to coincide with 2010, because 2010 is a census year, as is 2020, obviously. And what happens in the aftermath of a census is redistricting. And so if you can completely control the state house, you can control the redistricting process, at least in many states. And what we can see is that in 2020, in fact, one of the ways in which this was clearly not only a blue, but also a red wave election is to do with the fact that the Republicans actually consolidated control in roughly 20 states, where they will be now exclusively in charge of redistricting. And I know this is familiar. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to just refresh your memory on what happens when partisan districting occurs. We have technology and information, big data now, that allows us to do this much more effectively. That is to precisely draw uh, gerrymandered districts to be most advantageous to the party drawing the district lines, right? And so we've talked about Pennsylvania in the past, a state where essentially a little bit more than 50% of the population voted for Democrats in most of the elections during the last decade, but the state delegation was almost 3/4 Republican, right? Because of partisan gerrymandering. But in addition to skewing representation, gerrymandering also creates a situation where the most important election is the primary election, right? The district has been carved out so that the party doesn't really compete in the general election. It's a safe district. And what we know is that the people who vote in primaries, it's roughly 20% of the population, as opposed to 60% that votes during a presidential election, that those people tend to be more ideological, more partisan, more purist or true believers. And that creates a situation where if you don't toe the party line when you are in Congress, your party can discipline you by threatening to challenge you during the primary by somebody who is more ideologically extreme or pure than you are, right? And so this is a very important mechanism producing polarization. It's doing it more on the Republican side because they've been more aggressive about partisan districting and about primarying their own candidates. And it's one of the big factors that's driving the Republican Party to the right. And unfortunately, 2020 appears to have put us in a situation where there will be another decade's worth of partisan districting, and that promises to perhaps further amplify polarization in our country. We've looked at this together before, just refreshing your memory. And I've titled the slides somewhat differently this time. This is about the number of Republicans who don't think the election was fair. Please note that the data is from the middle of November, right? What the point, it was clear that Joe Biden had won the election, but before the Electoral College vote, before Mitch McConnell, for instance, congratulated Joe Biden as he did this last Monday. We will have to see if this number comes down a little bit. But what strikes me as particularly problematic about this, it's not just this sharp partisan discrepancy in the perception of a basic constitutional issue. Did we have a good election? Where 75% of Republicans are saying they're not confident we did. 80, 90% of Democrats are saying, yes, it was a good election, right? But even more than that, we had a good election in a very bad time, right? We had it during a pandemic with lots of headwinds, with tremendous polarization, with lots of worries about political violence, with protest politics spilling out on our streets with Black Lives Matter, but also with pro-Trump forces engaging in street-level politics a fair bit. And despite all of that, we had record turnout, we had very few problems, the electoral system held. But we can't even pat ourselves on the back for that, given the extent of polarization. And of course, this will potentially greatly hamper Joe Biden when he enters the presidency if a plurality, a large portion of Republican constituents do not believe that he is a legitimately elected president. What incentive do congressional Republicans have to cooperate with him, as opposed to the incentive to completely obstruct or stonewall his policies. And so, again, 2020 appears to be amplifying trends that have been in our society for a long time. Now, I want to call your attention to one way of kind of summarizing what we've been talking about. This is from an article that came out very recently in Science magazine, and it's on what the authors call political sectarianism, the idea that in essence, the kinds of divisions that we have in terms of partisanship in America today are perhaps growing more similar to religious sectarian conflict in intolerant societies. And they summarize this by showing how much the rise in negative partisanship has occurred over the last 40 years, right? So 40 years ago, this is a temperature thermometer rating, right? Uh, Basically, people in the United States were neutral to the other party in 1980. And in 2020, we are very cold to the other party, right? The temperature reading is between 30 and 35%. And what this means, among other things, is if you subtract how you feel positively about your own party, if you subtract from that how negatively you feel about the other party, you can get an overall number, right? Which shows the relationship between in party affection and out party hatred. And what we see is that now out party hatred is much more important than in party affection in explaining partisan behavior. And so this is just another way of thinking about how polarized we are at the moment and the kind of polarization we have. We're not having a competition about ideas and public policy primarily, these authors suggest. What we're really having is a simple rivalry with a group that we view as different from us, hostile to us, untrustworthy, and frankly immoral, right? And that kind of competition doesn't lend itself to either political compromise or deliberation. It is unhealthy for a democracy. And again, the concern is that 2020 is amplifying this kind of partisanship. So, why does this matter so much now? Again, a diagram that I'm sure you're growing tired of, right? We all are in terms of its effects. The country is on fire with a deadly viral pandemic at the moment. It is doing more and more damage, taking more and more lives, but there is good news. We now have a second vaccine that's been approved, and the vaccines are highly effective. But we are polarized on the question of whether or not to trust the vaccine or not, right? And the partisan distortion of trust in the vaccines may very well imperil public health. As I tried to show you last week, the percentage of people who don't trust the vaccine is high enough to undermine the efficacy of vaccination for allowing us to resume normal activity, right? We need to change people's minds, but will hyperpartisanship prevent us from doing that? It's also the case, obviously, that the virus, and sorry, it looks like my slide didn't quite format the way I thought it was going to, is doing deep damage to the economy. We have more and more people who are long-term unemployed out of the labor market for 27 weeks or more. I've explained to you that that tends to be a threshold in which it gets much more difficult to resume your career, get back into the labor market. That part of this is seen in the fact that we've had a significant drop in labor force participation. We are down about 10 million jobs from where we were at the beginning of this year. And to give you a sense, that means we've lost about 4 years worth of job creation, essentially in a few weeks in April, and not regain them in the subsequent months. And so this raises the prospect of long-term damage to the economy, long-term loss in work, employment, wages, consumer spending, long-term economic contraction. In addition to that, it obviously raises the problem of immediate duress. And as you can see, there are about 50 million people in the United States experiencing food vulnerability or scarcity right now. That means missing meals or unclear how they can afford meals, having to go to food banks, et cetera. And you've seen the lines, I'm sure, in the news coverage, as well as nearly 10% of the population experiencing housing insecurity. That means tens of millions of people who don't know how they're going to pay their rent or their mortgage. And we're about to fall off a benefits cliff. There is negotiation ongoing to see if we can get legislation out of DC to do something about this, but it is stalled. And it is stalled because of partisan polarization. The holdup over the question of whether to authorize the Federal Reserve to use money in a stopgap measure to restore liquidity to credit markets, it's almost unbelievable that that would stop aid that is so desperately needed immediately by people who are hungry and facing eviction, but also in the long term for the health of the economy as well. So again, just another indication of why partisan paralysis matters so much to us here and now. Now, having said that, I'm going to now transition more quickly than the past few weeks into the analysis of where the polarization is coming from and what we can do about it. Just to refresh your memory, dealing with Michael Tomasky's recently published book, If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved. And I'm not going to really review this with you. I'll just point out to you very quickly that Tomasky believes that in 3 out of the 4 major ages of American partisanship, we have been polarized. But in 2 out of those 3 ages, the polarization was within the parties, not exclusively between the parties. In the age of consensus, there was some polarization still organized within the parties, but there was also a whole slew of experiences and structural forces that brought us together: the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and there was also a deliberate project of consensus formation that led to norms of decency and commonality in American politics. You may have seen David Brooks' homage to Mark Shields in the New York Times yesterday, and the indication that Mark Shields represents this kind of 1950s, 1960s mindset about American politics. And part of what Tomasky is suggesting to us is that we have continued to expect our politicians to be able to come together, to compromise, to deliberate, to look out for the common good, once the structural roots that were bringing them together decayed. And that in a sense, we have to stop having our expectations and our politicians informed by conditions that are no longer in effect. We are in an age of fracture. Structural forces are pulling our parties apart. We have to not just think of this as a failure of leadership or behavioral or normative failure on the part of our politicians. The roots are deeper, and we need to understand those roots to be able to figure out how to address it. So here are the roots. And again, I'm going to go somewhat quickly through the stuff that I've already covered with you, right? Big sources of cultural difference that emerged in our country in the 1960s and 1970s around civil rights, around race and justice, and the question of whether or not white America owed a significant debt of justice to African Americans, and if that meant relinquishing some privilege and some standing. Immigration, right? There was immigration reform in the middle of the 1960s, and that has radically altered the demographics of our countries to the point where we may have the highest percentage of our population foreign born that we've ever had, or at least that we've had for 150 years. And that the result is we're becoming rapidly a so-called majority minority society. Changes in gender and family structures with women's greater participation in the workforce, greater sexual liberation as a result of birth control and abortion, more frequent children being born out of wedlock or in untraditional single parent gay families, etc. And this, of course, goes with changes in sexuality and the decline of traditional religion. And as I've pointed out to you, many people view these changes as primarily progressive, but many people also view them as hostile or disorienting or an assault on the values that allow them to make meaning out of their lives. And we have to be honest about the fact that when rapid cultural change occurs, not everybody welcomes it. And in a sense, psychologically, we should be able to understand why rapid cultural change might appear hostile and frightening to some people. Of course, it isn't just rapid cultural change. There was also rapid economic change. And this is sometimes referred to as the transition from a manufacturing to a post-industrial economy. More and more of the wealth generated in our society is generated in information technology and entertainment and services, and not in the manufacturing of goods. And that has had uneven geographic effects, right? The people who lived in regions where the heart of the economy was industrial have seen their jobs go away. It's led to a rapid increase in inequality. And we are a much more unequal society today than we were 50, 60 years ago. We have a much smaller share of our population in the middle class. We've pushed the population up and down into the extremes of the hyper wealthy and those who are left out. And those who are left out are very resentful of the new wealth that is being created, but not fairly distributed. Finally, at a point that Flossie emphasized in talking about Tomasky's book, he points out that another economic development of the age of fracture has been that we've put more emphasis on consumerism. We spend more time on our devices, entertaining ourselves. We're more identified with our brand. Shopping and consumption, the basket of goods that we purchase has become more important to our identity, and it's resulted in a kind of privatization of identity, in which if there's a trade-off between what we spend our time on, whether it's private consumption or some sort of public engagement, the last 50 years has seen a shift in activity away from public engagement of a kind that if we were to do it, it might bring us into contact with those whom we are suspicious or hostile, right? This goes back to Robert Putnam's account in Bowling Alone. If you're in a bowling league, you may end up bowling against a team that does not share your partisan perspective. And as you hang out with them and drink beer and throw bowling balls, you may come to see that they're not quite as bad as your stereotype of them is, right? So in a society that pulls us into civic engagement, it becomes harder to demonize the partisan other. In a society in which we are pulled into civic privatism, it becomes easier to have the kind of partisan polarization in which we really think of the partisan other as an enemy. Technological change, and this is another extremely important factor, are News is no longer broadcast, it's narrowcast, so that we tend to see news that is ideologically confirming of what we already believe. It doesn't challenge us to see things from the other point of view. And then digital technology has allowed us to multiply still further the sources of information we want, including the introduction of social media, where what this means is media that allow individuals to produce and disseminate their own content peer to peer. This is not one to many as broadcast media are, but many to many kinds of media. And Tomasky, I think, is very convincing when he says that this technology is the first major advance in communications technology over the last 1,000 years, going all the way back to Gutenberg, that has been bad for democracy. That previous advances in communication technology have made knowledge more broadly available, have made public opinion formation more open, have increased the ability for us to work together in collective action. This technology is anti-deliberative. It does not encourage arguments. It does not encourage reasoning or listening to the other. The primary thing that circulates is so-called memes, little blurbs or videos that are meant to play on your emotions, not to speak to your reason, not to argue. And they are engineered to generate so-called dopamine feedback loops, to be addictive. And so to keep our eyes on the screen and on the things that please or anger or outrage us or provoke anxiety. And so we end up with a different affect being produced by our communication technology. It's obviously fragmented the information and communication system, right? And we're seeing this with new social media and news outlets popping up in the aftermath of the 2020 election, when Fox won't say that Trump won the election, right? So news sources come out very quickly. We get an ever smaller fragmentation of the communication system, to the point where we really don't refer to a shared reality anymore. The increased ease of transmission of mis and disinformation, right? It's out there about the coronavirus vaccine. It's out there about the coronavirus, and it's obviously out there about the election of 2020. There's more and more bad information circulating, and it is more difficult to tell what is good from bad information in this new media ecosystem. And finally, this too is increasing civic privatism, leading us to enjoy the communication and the privacy of our own home, our own bedroom, our own bathroom, our own car, right? We don't even need to be in contact with the people in our own household to take advantage of this technology. Now, I've got Russia, and Tomasky has Russia listed under technological change, and obviously he wrote this long before the news of the recent apparent Russian hack on U.S. information technology, especially government networks, and I think one of the things that Tomasky is emphasizing is that in 2016 we were already polarized. We were already deeply divided. But Russia gave us a push, right? They used social media, they used bots, they used fake news accounts, they used RT, Russian TV, to disseminate a whole bunch of bad information. And when you have these kinds of technological change, you open your public sphere not only to domestically generated disinformation, but also to your enemies, who can flood your public sphere with bad news and bad information, use their state-based intelligence services to do research about how best to exacerbate your underlying divisions and weaknesses. And so this is, in a sense, very much part of the technological change, as well as part of the story of increased polarization in the United States. I'll be very quick on globalization. This is really more me than Tomasky. And part of the argument here is that although we have been weakened by partisanship and paralysis, there are other factors that have limited the efficacy of legislation, policy in the last 30, 40 years. Among them is the fact that we are in an increasingly globalized world in which jobs and capital easily move across borders, and that diminishes the power of our country to unilaterally impose legislative requirements on the actors in our economy. If we raise our taxes, if we increase employee contributions to healthcare or other benefits, those employers or investors may go elsewhere and we may lose out. At least that's been the dominant concern on the part of both Democrats and Republicans. And so this is another factor that is undermining the efficacy of policy, which is then contributing to polarization. Final two factors here: changes in the nature of the political parties. And here, Tomasky is of the perspective, and I agree, that we've seen asymmetrical polarization. This is not a case where the two parties moved equally apart, more or less the same amount at the same rate. As a matter of fact, quite to the opposite. Although the Republicans moved rather dramatically to the right from the 1970s to the present, the Democrats actually moved, if you look at this objectively, somewhat to the right before tacking back a little bit to the left, right? Under Clinton and Obama, in terms of policy and ideology, the Democrats actually moved to the right, but the Republicans were moving so quickly to the right that we nevertheless experienced greater polarization. And Tomasky draws on some literature. I think it's very good, interesting, important literature that suggests that not only have the parties stopped being cross-cutting coalitions in which you have conservative Democrats from the South joining Labor Democrats from the Northeast, or liberal Republicans from New England joining conservative pro-business Republicans from the Midwest. They've become ideologically sorted, right? If you're a liberal, you're a Democrat. If you're a conservative, you're a Republican. There's no internal diversity or ideological heterogeneity to our parties anymore. But it's also the case that, in a sense, the Democrats and Republicans have become different kinds of parties. The Democrats have become or remained a group interest coalition party, a different kind of group interest coalition party because they're much more an ethnic coalition right now. And as Tomasky points out, if you're trying to do what Joe Biden is trying to do right now, trying to assemble a cabinet, you have 20 or 30 different constituencies all demanding that they have representation at the highest level in your cabinet, right? And that's indicative of the way in which the Democrats build their coalition. They build it by assembling a kind of patchwork of different ethnic and racial and gender and sexuality and interest groups. And they do that around a broadly inclusive, liberal, multicultural agenda. So there is an ideology to it, but it's an ideology that seeks to integrate a diverse coalition. The Republicans have become what Tomasky calls, following a whole political science literature, a social movement party. They really, on his account, have been captured by a very narrow ideology. And he gives two main examples. The first is the Norquist tax pledge, right? Familiar to Californians, of course, going all the way back to Proposition 13. But the idea being that in order to be a viable Republican candidate for the last 20 years, almost all Republicans have signed on to Grover Norquist's no new tax pledge, right? And this makes it practically impossible for Republicans to then negotiate with Democrats because, in a sense, they know that if that negotiation is going to include the possibility of increasing taxes, and if they violate their pledge, they're going to be primaried and then potentially kicked out of office, they can't even really begin the conversation. And then there's the Hastert rule, which goes back to Dennis Hastert when he was House leader. And this is the idea that Republicans will not consider any bill that does not have majority Republican support. So again, this forestalls, makes it impossible for there to be a coalition that is majority Democrat, minority Republican. And the reason that Tomasky points us to these two issues is that it indicates the degree to which the Republicans have become a party with strict ideological litmus tests in which adherence to that ideology is more important than legislating or governing, right? And that this then is indicative of the fact that the Republican Party has really deeply shifted. He points out that this was a very deliberate movement. I will show you very quickly my next big book. I don't know how good it's going to be. It's getting good reviews, but Evil Genius by Kurt Anderson, The Unmaking of America, is about the effort, and you know, we've talked about Democracy in Chains and other books, the effort on the part of a group of very wealthy American businessmen to remake the Republican Party, going all the way back to the Powell Memorandum in the 1970s, and with the Koch brothers playing an outsized role, but certainly not alone. This effort to really demand ideological purity from the Republican Party is not spontaneous. It didn't come from nowhere or from the grassroots. It was funded, it was deliberate, it was sustained over 50 years. And the result is that we now have a very different kind of Republican Party in 2020 than we had in 1980. And then all of this leads to this hardening of partisan identity and the growth of negative partisanship. I've italicized identity here in the sense that it appears that for many of us, the identity as a partisan is more important than the policy positions that the party embraces. And this is one of the ironies in all of this, which is that when we look at things in terms of policy positions, it's not clear that we are deeply polarized. But when we look at things in terms of the actual way we vote, we are absolutely mistrustful of the other side, think it's an existential disaster if they get elected, right? And so this reflects the idea that partisanship is as much an identity as it is a package of policies in 2020 America. Final factor that Tomasky emphasizes is Trump. And he points out that Trump has further exacerbated these trends, particularly by weaponizing white ethno-nationalist resentment, right? The idea that when we look back at all of these things that are driving the fracture of the United States, whether it's technological change, economic change, or cultural change, that all of that can be, in a sense, translated into racial resentment of immigrants and African Americans. And that although the Republicans had been flirting with ethno-nationalist politics, dog whistling for a long time, Trump replaced the dog whistle with a bullhorn. And so it's very difficult, once that has occurred, to put that back in the bottle. And so we may be stuck with a new generation of Republican leaders who see Trumpist politics, white ethno-nationalist politics, the politics of anger and resentment against minorities, against coastal elites, as the best path to electoral viability for a decade to come. And then the other factor with Trump, which hardly needs mentioning at the moment, is the disregard for constitutional civic institutions, customs. I point out that McConnell paved the way for this before Trump was elected, but the growing concern that one of our two major parties is playing a no holds barred game in politics, where if the Constitution has to go under the bus, as we see in the Texas lawsuit against Michigan and Pennsylvania, if civic institutions need to be dismantled, if customs need to be disregarded, so be it. All right. So, with that grim prognosis, this gets us to the question, what can we do to fix all of this? And I've already started the conversation today noting that 2020 looks like it harbors another decade's worth of gerrymandered congressional districts. The first political fix, and Tomasky groups his fixes into two categories: political fixes and, as we'll see in a moment, social and cultural fixes. The first political fix would be to end gerrymandering, right? And a number of states have already done this. There does appear to be some demand for this, even on the part of Republican rank and file voters. That this is something that people actually do view as suspect when the districts are too rigged to produce electoral outcomes that favor only the party in power, despite whatever happens with the popular vote. And so if we could end partisan gerrymandering, if we could turn the redistricting process over to panels of judges or bipartisan commissions or nonpartisan commissions, as many states are in fact doing, we could end one major structural force that is pushing the parties in the direction of polarization. But as Tomasky points out, as a long literature in political science points out, when we use single member electoral districts, we tend to produce a two-party system, and that has a tendency often to produce ideological polarization. And so Tomasky points out there's nothing in the Constitution that says we have to have single member districts. We could bring back at-large congressional districts. So one large congressional district for New York City or the San Francisco Bay Area, for instance, right, in which we would be voting for 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 members of Congress as opposed to just one. And the result of that would be that it wouldn't boil down to just one of two people, that there would be probably a greater reward for moderate candidates who wouldn't have to worry as much about being primaried because they would be competing in a large pool in the general election. This would be especially the case if we also introduced ranked choice voting, as is occurring increasingly in many municipal areas in the United States. That is to say, a form of voting in which you don't just say, if there are 5 congressional members, these are the 5 people I vote for. Maybe you vote for 10 people. And if 1 or 2 of your top choices doesn't get over the threshold to be elected, your vote tumbles down to somebody else. And again, this system of ranked choice voting increases the likelihood that there's going to be more than 2 parties, increases the likelihood that moderate candidates are going to be viable, decreases the structural pressure to polarization. Fourth idea, expand the House of Representatives to 500 members. That's a relatively minor expansion, right? And it's funny. I just did a constitutional convention simulation with my students, and so it was worthwhile remembering when the House was founded. There were only 60 members. It's been expanded again and again and again up until the beginning of the 20th century, and now we've gone 100 years without expanding the House of Representatives, despite our population more than doubling in that period. So part of the idea would be to create somewhat smaller districts or more representatives, again, to allow for greater competition, a greater likelihood that a more moderate candidate would eventually prevail, as well as to increase the accountability of representatives to their voters. Fifth idea, eliminate the Senate filibuster. And we've talked about this before, that part of the problem in the United States today that is driving polarization is the way in which our institutions amplify minority power. And the truth of the matter is that the Republican Party rarely gets an electoral majority in this society, but because of the way in which the Electoral College and the Senate function in particular, combined with partisan gerrymandering, the power of the minority is sometimes greater than the power of the majority. And that encourages them to engage in strategic politicking to try to further disenfranchise or marginalize the minority, I'm sorry, the majority, instead of working with them. So one simple way to counteract some of this minoritarianism would be to eliminate the Senate filibuster. And again, these are changes that can be done so far without constitutional amendment. This would require perhaps a simple Senate majority vote. It could happen should the Democrats win both the runoffs in Georgia. I'm not sure it will happen. I think there's some reservation about the Republicans regaining control of the Senate and not having the filibuster to constrain them. It's already been partially lifted, as we know, on judicial votes, for instance. Get rid of the Electoral College or make it obey the popular vote. We've talked about this before. I think the idea of states passing laws that require their electors to vote for the candidate who won the popular vote is the most likely way to bypass the Electoral College. Again, this is a way of making sure that the majority's voice is actually registered in our politics and of discouraging my campaign strategies aimed exclusively at a minority of voters. Seventh, and I want to focus here for a minute. And so the seventh idea here is to revive moderate republicanism. And I want to focus here because Tomasky readily admits that his ideas are utopian. That this is, as he puts it, at one point throwing pies at the sky. But this idea, it seems to me, in a sense, is both the most utopian and the most genius of his ideas in the political sphere. And I believe he is probably writing fairly directly to Michael Bloomberg and George Soros and maybe Jeff Bezos, people who have billions of dollars. And his idea is basically, if you have a few more moderate Republicans because you've had a move to multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, and you're worried that they're going to get primaried in the next election, or even if a courageous Republican, let's call him Mitt Romney, votes with the Democrats on some legislative bills and they get through Congress as a result, are those people committing political suicide? And in a sense, they are, unless and until there is an organized constituency ready to counteract the very well organized, powerful social forces that will primary any Republican that breaks ranks. And so what Tomasky is saying we need is people like Soros and Bezos and Bloomberg to not just finance Democrats, but to finance moderate Republicans in primary campaigns, to allow the Republican Party to eventually become a modern conservative party. You know that one of my intellectual heroes is John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill said a good democracy needs both a healthy liberal and a healthy conservative party, and that we get better progress actually by listening to and being corrected by the other side. But in order to be able to have a healthy conversation with a conservative party, that conservative party has to have a meaningful view of the public good. And part of what's happened with the capture of the Republican Party by a narrow social movement is that they have increasingly become an extremist party, a party that is not willing to work with the other side. And so one of the big issues here is we really need reform from the Republican Party. That's not going to come, it doesn't look like, in the aftermath of 2020 through simple electoral loss. It's going to have to come as a result of a concerted effort. This, of course, takes for granted that Citizens United is the law of the land for the foreseeable future. Money is going to continue to flood our politics. Therefore, the only way to revive moderate republicanism is to fund it. Now, let me briefly look at these other pies that Tomasky is throwing in the sky. And you will see that these are primarily civil society initiatives. I've talked with you a little bit about this at the end of class, the end of the lecture last week. Establish foreign interstate college student exchange programs to get the kids from red states going to blue states and vice versa. Reduce college to 3 years and have a 4th year of service, where the 4th year of service also is primarily designed to get young adults to go to places in the country that are very different from the place that they come from. Expand student exchange programs in high schools to do the same thing, and create incentives for large employers to offer exchange programs for young professionals to also move around the country. And part of what I showed you, and I'll just to return to this for a moment, sorry for the dizzying pace of going through the slides, but this negative partisanship, right? This tremendous mistrust for the other side, outright hostility, the fact that we are now more mobilized to vote on the basis of our mistrust and dislike of the other side than our affection or attraction to our own side, involves a kind of demonization or othering, a sense that the people who support Trump have to be retrograde, racist Neanderthals. The people who support Biden or Clinton have to be liberal elites who don't give a damn about real Americans, right? That we need to overcome the way in which social media and the decline of civil society, the growth of civic privatism, hyper-partisanship, the hardening of partisan identities have led us to really segregate ourselves ideologically and totally mistrust the other side. And so these proposals taken together are designed to force us back together. Hopefully we don't have another world war. We're not going to be thrown together in the trenches or the tanks or the battleships, but maybe we can actually deliberately engineer geographic mobility. Now, I've said, I believe to you before, that I would add to this list creating a lot more affordable housing in the most vibrant economic growth engines in the United States, the 10 most productive metropolitan areas, so that people who want to come from the areas in the country where jobs have evaporated and been replaced by much more precarious forms of work can actually make it to those cities, not see it as prohibitively expensive. Very quickly, vastly expand civic education, and we spoke a little bit about that last week. Insist that the left doesn't contribute to the fracture. I think he would not be very happy with defund the police, right? And demand that corporate and business leaders commit to social responsibility, that Jeff Bezos, for instance, contributes to moderate republicanism rather than supporting Alex and other legislative lobbying branches that seem to, in many ways, contradict his politics. I am going to stop there. I know I sprinted through those recommendations. I did want to actually finish this today. I've got a few minutes for questions, comments, thoughts. I think I've already got a couple in the chat. Let me see what we've got. From Bob, yes, the pandemic has obviously exacerbated the lack of social interaction. Absolutely the case, yes. And one of the interesting questions will be, does this in fact represent a permanent acceleration and deepening of trends that were already present, right? So that we just become more and more work from home, more and more, doing Zoom happy hours with our friends, as opposed to actually congregating in public. So yes, I completely agree with that. And at the same time, it hasn't unified us. And then John writes, Democrats were always a group interest coalition, but it used to be not only identity groups, but also economic groups, laborers, farmers, regional economic interests, etc. Absolutely agreed with that, John. And of course, part of the problem in particular is with labor's decline, right? The cutting in half of private sector unionized workforce, the lack of political clout on the part of labor unions as a result, in a sense, forced the Democratic Party to reconfigure its coalition. I can see Flossie has her hand up. Go ahead. You're going to have to unmute yourself, Flossie. I'm going to have to unmute you, and then you're going to have to unmute yourself. Give me one moment. Okay, I've unmuted everyone. Background noise will pick up. Go ahead, Flossie. Hold your space bar down, please.
We need a child to lead us. In the spirit of Christmas and all the good that comes out of Christmas, we need a child to lead us. And I have the child at St. Jude.
Who is that?
Talk more about this. We need the voice of innocence to remind people in Congress that there's such a thing as compassion. There's such a thing called love, and it begins with the love you feel for a child. And I know this is sentimental, and I know it's consumerism, but just for a moment, that little
hand back on the spacebar, Flossie. You cut yourself off. All right. So Flossie, I'm no longer hearing you. But since we can't hear you, Flossie, because you're not holding your spacebar down.
Now?
Now, yes.
All I'm asking is that we need a child to lead us, a child to remind us what compassion is and what love is. And there are plenty of children who can speak for us. They're the kids that we see on our television sets. And some of them are so eloquent, they might make a difference.
Yeah, and so interesting comment. And I have to say, I'm thinking of Greta Thunberg, right? When you say this, who's a, still a girl, an adolescent, or the wonderful children from, is it Marjorie, what's the name of the high school? uh, somebody's trying to supply me with the name. I'm forgetting the full name. Marjorie Stoneman High School, who did such a great job raising consciousness about what gun violence means in terms of the experience of being in school. So yes, I do think, part of the problem is that basically almost everybody in politics is middle-aged or older, and that they have worked their way through institutions and networks that demand a certain kind of loyalty of them, right? And this goes back to what's sometimes called the pre-primary primary, the money primary, right? Who are people willing to invest in? And for the most part, it's not the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes, the young, fresh people. It is people who have proven their ideological bona fides through party service over a long time. And that, I think, is a really interesting point, Flossie. I know that you're talking more generally than just about election, but yes, that sometimes the young are much better at returning us to our moral senses than adults. Anybody else with a comment or a thought? I think John, and we've got another couple comments in the chat, which I'll share with everybody. Elizabeth Porter says, please discuss how abortion has produced many single issues voters for the Republicans. Okay, and I'll be brief here, but I think it's actually very illustrative of what's happened in American politics over the last 50 years. You may be aware, in the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, abortion was really not a partisan issue. There were roughly the same number of voters who were pro-life and Democrat and pro-choice and Republican, that we hadn't really polarized around this issue. There were many people who thought it was a matter of personal morality. After the Roe v. Wade decision, and then in 1976, when Ronald Reagan ran for the presidency, didn't get it, but he demanded, because he had significant representation at the Republican National Nominating Convention, that there be a pro-life plank in the Republican platform. And that's really the beginning of a sorting out that occurred. And two things occurred at the same time. One is a certain number of Catholics and evangelicals left the Democratic Party, and a certain number of women left the Republican Party as a result of their disagreements with the party's positions on abortion. But the dominant trend, the main thing that happened, is Republicans got the message. I'm a Republican, I'm supposed to be pro-life. Democrats got the message. I'm a Democrat, I'm supposed to be pro-choice. And we aligned our policy positions with our partisan identities. I know it doesn't feel like that in 2020. And I know I can't reduce the complexity of an issue like abortion to mere partisan identity. But this is when we look at partisan polarization, a really good example of what happens when it becomes hyper-polarized, when it becomes effective as opposed to ideological polarization. The reason I'm pro-choice is because I'm a Democrat, as opposed to I'm a Democrat because I'm pro-choice, right? In a sense, it's the tail wagging the dog. It's the partisan identity driving the policy position. And we're seeing more and more of that in American politics, and it's making it harder and harder to work with the other side. So thank you for that. Elizabeth, Bonnie says, what about global warming and how it brings the entire world together to deal with it? Again, Bonnie, you and I have talked about this a number of times before, and obviously we're both, and everyone should be deeply concerned. This is an existential threat, not only to human life, but to biological life on the planet, right? We and in a sense, we probably shouldn't be talking about anything else. But having said that, it's also become an issue of partisan polarization. It's as shameful or even more shameful than what's happened with the coronavirus, right? Why can't we come together when we're facing such deep challenges that are not partisan in terms of how they affect us, right? They affect all of us equally. They don't discriminate on the basis of party. And yet, majority of Republicans do not believe that climate change is real, right? Or that it's man-made, or that we understand it, or that it's a major threat. And so, yes, unfortunately, we have a chicken and an egg problem here. We may not be able to even recognize threats that should be unifying us as common until we overcome the way in which the partisan lens we view the world through distorts our perception of the world. And so, Bonnie, thank you for that comment. I'm going through the scroll bar, but why don't I ask, does anybody have something they want to say before we wrap up for today? Go ahead and yeah, David, go ahead.
You referred to some group that George Soros or Bezos belongs to. I was not familiar with that.
Yeah, ALEC is the name of the group. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a industry association that sponsors primarily state-level legislation, quite anti-union, anti-regulatory, anti-environmental, often anti-tax as well. And one of the issues here is people like Bezos, who appear to be progressive on many social or cultural issues, nevertheless give money to ALEC and other quite conservative organizations because it's in their business interest to do so, right? So that was the background. Thank you for calling my attention to that, David. I know I was moving fast, and I'm sorry, I should have explained. Let's see. Joe and Doris, probably Doris, says, where and how does religion play a role in the current political system? I'm not going to tackle that today. That'll have to be a question for another day, but clearly we are polarized on religion as well. And that was one of those cultural fracture issues I pointed to, that for some of us, the idea that religion has become more a matter of individual choice, of assembling views that fit your conscience or your experience, is liberating and opens up new possibilities. For other people, the idea that people are no longer going to traditional organized churches or religious organizations is indicative of the collapse of one of the pillars of our society, right? And so we are also coming apart, polarized on the issue of the kinds of changes in religion that our society has seen over the last 50 years. All right, everybody. Really good spending time with you again today. I didn't ask how you're doing. We ended up talking about Liz and her great work for Piedmont Garden at the beginning. I do hope you're hanging in there. I know things are hard in the world for many of us, particularly hard around the holiday season. The good news is, right, that the vaccines are getting approved. They're getting out there. They're starting to work. You guys keep being strong, smart, safe, and well. And I will see you all next week. Take care. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye, guys.